The September evening air hung thick with the scent of hothouse roses and expensive perfume, as Beatrice Ashford stood near the refreshment table at Pemberton Hall, trying to make herself invisible. It was a skill she'd perfected over the past 2 years since her father's death had left her and her mother clinging to genteel poverty like shipwreck survivors clutching driftwood. Her gown was 3 seasons old, the pale green silk carefully mended where the hem had frayed, the lace at the sleeves turned and restitched so many times that the pattern had begun to blur, but it was clean and pressed, and Lady Margaret had insisted they attend the Pemberton ball despite their reduced circumstances, despite the whispers that followed them through every social gathering, despite the fact that their invitation had likely been extended out of pity rather than genuine welcome. Beatrice was 24 years old, unmarried, and growing more unmarriageable by the day. She had dark auburn hair that refused to hold a fashionable arrangement, green eyes that her mother called expressive, and society matrons called too direct, and a tongue that had gotten her into trouble more times than she could count. She read newspapers, she had opinions, she spoke to them aloud. These were not qualities that endeared a woman to potential suitors, particularly a woman with no fortune, no significant connections, and a father whose gambling debts had consumed the family estate before killing him with apoplexy at the age of 52. "You're doing it again," Caroline Fletcher murmured at her elbow, her voice warm with affection despite the gentle reproach. Caroline was the vicar's daughter, solidly middle class, and Beatrice's only true friend in the entire county of Kent. That expression that suggests you're cataloguing everyone's moral failings for future reference. "I can't help it," Beatrice replied quietly, her eyes scanning the glittering assembly with barely concealed contempt. "Look at them, dripping with jewels while their tenant families struggle to afford bread. Dancing and laughing while children work 14-hour days in coal mines and cotton mills. It's obscene. It's also the world we live in," Caroline said pragmatically, though her own father shared Beatrice's reformist sympathy. Thomas Fletcher was one of the few clergymen in Kent who actually preached about social justice rather than simply collecting his tithes and looking the other way. And making scenes at balls won't change it. It will only make your situation more difficult than it already is. But Beatrice's attention had been caught by a commotion near the ballroom's raised platform. The Duke of Thornhill had arrived, and the assembled guests were arranging themselves with the precision of planets orbiting the sun, drawn by the gravity of wealth and power and title. Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Thornhill, was 31 years old and looked like he'd been carved from marble by a sculptor commissioned to create the ideal of aristocratic perfection. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair swept back from a face of classical proportions, grey eyes that held the cool certainty of a man who had never been contradicted, and a bearing that communicated absolute authority without a single word being spoken. He wore his evening clothes with the careless elegance of someone who had never had to think about whether he could afford them, and he moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who knew every door would open before him, every person would step aside to let him pass. Beatrice had never met him personally, but she knew of him. Everyone in Kent knew of the Duke of Thornhill. His estates sprawled across 3 counties. His coal mines employed hundreds of workers in the northern reaches of his properties. His investments in railways and shipping had made him one of the wealthiest men in England. He sat in the House of Lords, where he voted consistently against every reform measure that came before him, and he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in society, despite showing no apparent interest in actually marrying anyone. Lord Pemberton was calling for attention, tapping his wineglass with a silver spoon until the orchestra fell silent and conversations died into expectant quiet. "Distinguished guests, we are deeply honoured tonight by the presence of His Grace, the Duke of Thornhill, who has graciously agreed to speak about the remarkable modernisation efforts currently transforming his mining operations in the north." Polite applause rippled through the ballroom. Sebastian ascended the platform with 3 economical steps, declining to use the small staircase that had been provided. He surveyed the assembled guests with that cool grey gaze, and Beatrice felt something tighten in her chest. Anger, perhaps, or recognition of something she'd seen before in men of power. The absolute confidence that came from never having to question whether you deserved your position. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sebastian began, his voice cultured and commanding, each word precisely articulated. "I come before you tonight to discuss progress, the kind of progress that separates great nations from merely adequate ones. My mining operations have recently undergone significant modernization, implementing new techniques that have increased productivity by 37%, while reducing operational costs by nearly half." He spoke with evident pride about shaft depths and coal extraction rates, about machinery that replaced dozens of workers, about efficiency gains that had impressed even his fellow industrialists. The assembled guests nodded approvingly, murmuring to each other about innovation and modern thinking. "These improvements required difficult decisions," Sebastian continued, his tone suggesting he found such decisions regrettable but necessary. Wages were adjusted to reflect market realities. Shifts were extended to maximize equipment utilization. Certain safety protocols that reduced efficiency were necessarily modified, but the result has been a mining operation that serves as a model for the entire industry, proving that profit and progress are not only compatible, but inseparable. Something inside Beatrice snapped. It wasn't a dramatic breaking, more like a thread that had been pulled too tight for too long finally giving way. She thought of the newspapers she'd been reading, the reports of mining accidents that killed children, the descriptions of working conditions that sounded like something from the depths of hell rather than modern England. She thought of a name she'd seen repeated in multiple articles. Tommy Wright, age 9, crushed to death by an overloaded coal cart in the Thornhill mines just 3 months ago. And she thought of this man, this Duke, standing before society's elite and calling that child's death modernization. Her voice rang out clear and sharp before prudence could stop it. "Your Grace speaks eloquently of progress and efficiency. But what of the 8-year-old children working 14-hour shifts in your mines? What of the families who can no longer afford bread because you cut their wages by half while doubling their hours? What of Tommy Wright, who died in your modernized operation because safety protocols were necessarily modified?" The ballroom fell into the kind of shocked silence that follows a natural disaster, when the world holds its breath trying to comprehend what has just occurred. Every eye swiveled from Beatrice to the Duke and back again, like spectators at a particularly scandalous tennis match. Beside her, Caroline made a small sound of horror. Lady Margaret, standing across the room near Lady Pemberton, went white as death. But Beatrice stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides, her chin raised in defiance of every social convention she was violating. Sebastian's grey eyes found her with laser precision, locating her in the crowd with the focus of a hunting hawk spotting prey. His expression didn't change dramatically, no flash of anger, no widening of surprise, just a subtle hardening, a cooling of features that had already been fairly cold to begin with. He descended from the platform with deliberate steps, each footfall measured and controlled. The crowd parted before him like water before a ship's prow, guests stumbling over themselves in their haste to clear his path. He stopped directly in front of Beatrice, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "And you are?" His voice was controlled, dangerous, each syllable precisely enunciated with the kind of aristocratic diction that could make a simple question sound like a judgment. Beatrice curtsied with mechanical correctness, years of deportment training taking over even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Miss Beatrice Ashford, Your Grace." Ashford. He tested the name slowly, as if tasting something bitter. "Sir George Ashford's daughter, I believe. The late Sir George, whose gambling debts consumed his estate before his untimely death. I see financial imprudence runs in the family, along with a tendency toward inappropriate public displays." The insult landed like a slap, but Beatrice refused. "My father's mistakes don't invalidate the truth about your mining practice. Tommy Wright was 9 years old when he died. His mother is a widow with 3 younger children who now have no means of support because you deemed safety protocols inefficient. You speak of matters you do not understand, Sebastian said coldly, his voice dropping in volume but gaining in intensity. Mining is a complex industry requiring difficult economic calculations. I cannot run a profitable operation based on sentimental attachment to outdated practices. If the right family is in distress, there are poorhouses and charitable organizations designed to address such situations. It is not my responsibility to subsidize inefficiency out of misplaced compassion. Misplaced compassion, Beatrice repeated, her voice shaking now with barely controlled fury. You call basic human decency misplaced compassion? You call keeping children alive rather than crushed by machinery outdated practices? Sebastian's jaw tightened, the first visible crack in his aristocratic composure. He leaned slightly closer, close enough that Beatrice could smell his cologne, sandalwood and something crisp like winter air, and his voice dropped so only those immediately nearby could hear. You are an impertinent, presumptuous woman with romantic notions about economic realities you cannot possibly comprehend. You speak of things that are not your concern in a manner that is wholly inappropriate for a woman of any breeding whatsoever. He straightened to his full height, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the ballroom with deliberate projection, ensuring every guest could hear his pronouncement. It is clear that some young ladies have been allowed too much freedom to form opinions on subjects beyond their capacity to understand. Then, turning to Lord Pemberton, who stood nearby looking mortified, Sebastian delivered the killing blow with casual cruelty that made it even more devastating. That one is utterly unfit to be anyone's wife. No restraint, no feminine grace, no understanding of her proper place. Pity the poor fool who takes her on. The whispers exploded like gunfire, sharp and overlapping and merciless. Beatrice stood frozen, her face burning with humiliation and rage, a mortifying heat that spread from her cheeks down her neck to her chest. Around her, guests turned to each other with barely concealed delight, already composing the letters they would write tomorrow, the gossip they would spread, the scandal they would discuss for months to come. Caroline tried to pull her away, tugging insistently at her arm, but before they could retreat, Lady Margaret materialized through the crowd, her face ashen with mortification. Your Grace, I must apologize profusely for my daughter's unseemly outburst. Her mother's voice was high and strained, nearly unrecognizable. She meant no disrespect, I assure you. Mamma, no, Beatrice began, but Lady Margaret's sharp look silenced her more effectively than any words could have. Sebastian inclined his head with icy courtesy, the gesture somehow more insulting than any rebuke. See that she learns better manners, Lady, for her own sake, if not for yours. With that, he turned on his heel and strode away, the crowd parting before him once more. Guests eager to demonstrate their alignment with power rather than principle, eager to distance themselves from the woman who had just committed social suicide. Lady Margaret gripped Beatrice's arm, not harshly, but firmly enough to brook no argument. Come, we are leaving, now. The carriage ride home to Ashford Cottage was conducted in terrible silence. Lady Margaret stared out the window, her hands twisted in her lap, her face a mask of devastation. Beatrice sat across from her, still shaking with rage and humiliation, replaying every moment in her mind. The Duke's cold eyes, his dismissive tone, the casual cruelty of his final pronouncement. Unfit to be anyone's wife. The words echoed in her mind with the persistence of church bells, impossible to silence. She told herself she didn't care what that arrogant, privileged man thought. She told herself his opinion meant nothing, that the judgment of someone so divorced from ordinary human suffering was worthless. But her hands were shaking, and tears of fury and humiliation burned behind her eyes. When they arrived at Ashford Cottage, a name far grander than the reality of the small, crumbling manor house with its leaking roof and outdated furnishings, Lady Margaret finally spoke. Do you have any idea what you've done? Her voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have been. Any idea at all? I told the truth, Beatrice said, her own voice trembling. About children dying in his mines. About families starving because of his efficiency. What? Someone needed to say it. And you thought that someone should be you. Lady Margaret turned to face her daughter fully, and Beatrice saw tears tracking down her mother's cheeks. You, an unmarried woman with no fortune, no connections, no prospects. You thought you could challenge a duke in front of all of Kent's society and there would be no consequence. I couldn't stay silent. You could have, Lady Margaret interrupted. You should have. Beatrice, we are barely surviving as it is. We live on the charity of your father's distant relations. We attend social events only because people pity us. And now you've made us, objects of ridicule and scandal. Who will receive us now? What prospects did you have before tonight? They're gone now. Completely gone. The words hit like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. Beatrice sank into a chair, her elaborate upswept hair coming loose from its pins, her carefully mended gown suddenly feeling like a costume, a disguise that had failed to hide what she truly was. I'm sorry, Mum, she whispered. I'm so sorry. But sorry I couldn't undo what had been done. Sorry couldn't erase the Duke's pronouncement or the hundreds of witnesses who had heard it. Sorry I couldn't restore a reputation that had been destroyed in a matter of minutes. Lady Margaret wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that had seen better days. Go to bed, Beatrice. Tomorrow we'll begin addressing the damage. If that's even possible. Beatrice climbed the stairs to her small bedroom, still wearing her ball gown because she couldn't bear to ring for their single remaining maid at this hour. She stood at the window, looking out at the overgrown gardens and the fields beyond, moonlight painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. I was right, she whispered to the night, to the uncaring stars, to herself, about the mines, about the children, about him. I was right. But being right, she was discovering, didn't protect you from consequences. Being right didn't stop the whispers or restore your reputation, or undo the damage of challenging power with nothing but truth as your weapon. And somewhere across the county at Thornhill Park, Sebastian Blackwood likely wasn't thinking of her at all, wasn't losing a moment's sleep over the woman he'd publicly destroyed. Beatrice was wrong about that, though she had no way of knowing it. At Thornhill Park, Sebastian stood at the window of his study, a glass of expensive brandy sitting untouched on his desk, staring out at his manicured grounds without seeing them. He kept hearing her voice, sharp and clear and unafraid. Tommy Wright was 9 years old when he died. He'd been dismissive in the moment, armoured by aristocratic certainty and wounded pride. But now, in the quiet of his study with no audience to perform for, doubt crept in like cold air through a cracked window. Was there a Tommy Wright? Had a child actually died in his mines? Sebastian moved to his desk and pulled out the quarterly reports from his mine manager. Pages of figures, productivity statistics, profit margin, nothing about accidents, nothing about deaths. But then, why would there be? He'd never asked for such information. He'd hired competent managers, trusted them to handle operations efficiently, and collected his profits without questioning the methods. He found himself reaching for paper and pen, writing instructions to his secretary, making inquiries about mining accidents in the Thornhill Northern operations. Specifically, any incidents involving children, specifically anyone named Wright. Then he paused, pen hovering over paper, remembering Beatrice Ashford's green eyes blazing with righteous fury, her voice trembling but unwavering as she challenged him in front of everyone, unfit to be anyone's wife. The words he'd spoken seemed to echo back at him now, and for the first time, Sebastian felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest, something that might have been guilt if he allowed himself to examine it too closely. He didn't. Instead, he finished his instructions, sealed the letter, and told himself he was simply being thorough, due diligence, nothing more. But sleep eluded him that, and when he finally drifted off near dawn, he dreamed of green eyes and auburn hair, and a voice asking him what Tommy Wright's life had been worth in his calculations of efficiency and profit. The weeks that followed were exactly as terrible as Lady Margaret had predicted. Invitations stopped arriving at Ashford Cottage as abruptly as if a tap had been turned off. Former acquaintances crossed the street to avoid Beatrice. suddenly fascinated by shop windows on the opposite side. Even the vicar's wife, everyone except Caroline, bless her loyal heart, cornered Lady Margaret after Sunday service to deliver pointed observations about daughters who brought shame upon their families. Beatrice tried to hold her head high, tried to tell herself that the opinions of such people didn't matter, that she'd spoken truth, and truth was worth any cost. But it was hard to maintain that conviction when she saw her mother's face grow more drawn and worried with each passing day, when bills arrived that they couldn't pay, when their single remaining maid gave notice because she'd found a position elsewhere, with better prospects. Caroline visited daily, bringing news and small comforts, a basket of apples from the vicarage garden, a book she thought Beatrice would enjoy, her unfailing moral support. The whole county is still talking about it, Caroline reported one grey October afternoon as they sat in Ashford Cottage's shabby morning room, trying to stay warm despite the fire they could barely afford to keep burning. Half think you're a scandalous radical who got exactly what she deserved. The other half, she paused delicately, think the same thing, but are too polite to say it aloud. Beatrice finished bitterly. Actually, I think you were brave, Caroline corrected gently. My father heard from several tenant families who were glad someone finally challenged the Duke about working conditions. They don't dare say so publicly, of course, but privately, you've become something of a folk hero to the working classes. How wonderful, Beatrice said flatly. I'm beloved by people who have no social influence whatsoever and despised by everyone who does. That will certainly help my marriage prospects. You never cared much about marriage prospects before. I cared about not being a burden to my mother. Beatrice's voice cracked slightly. I cared about not spending my life as an object of pity and charity. Now I'm both, and I've dragged Mama down with me. Before Caroline could respond, before she could offer the comfort Beatrice desperately needed but couldn't quite accept, their maid, Mrs. Davies, who'd agreed to stay on for another month, appeared in the doorway looking uncertain. Miss Beatrice, Lady Margaret, there's a gentleman caller, Lord Philip Harrington. He says it's a matter of some urgency. Beatrice felt ice slide down her spine. She knew of Lord Harrington, though they'd never been formally introduced. He was a wealthy landowner, a widower of 45, and according to Caroline's careful investigations, a man with a reputation that made cautious people nervous. Show him in, Lady Margaret said, rising and smoothing her worn day dress with hands that trembled slightly. Lord Philip Harrington entered with the confident stride of a man who had never been refused anything he wanted. He was tall, well-dressed, with silver threading through dark hair, and features that might have been handsome, if not for something cold in his blue eyes, something predatory in the way he looked at Beatrice. Lady Margaret, Miss Ashford, thank you for receiving me. His voice was cultured, pleasant, his bow perfectly correct. I apologize for calling without prior arrangement, but I have a matter of some delicacy to discuss that I believe will be of considerable interest to you both. Please sit. Lady Margaret indicated the least worn of their chairs. May we offer you tea? That won't be necessary. This won't take long. Harrington settled himself comfortably, crossing one leg over the other with aristocratic ease. His eyes fixed on Beatrice with uncomfortable intensity. I'll come directly to the point. I have recently purchased certain debts previously held by various creditors, debts incurred by the late Sir George Ashford. The total amounts to approximately £6,000. Lady Margaret's face went white. Beatrice felt the world tilt sideways. 6,000, her mother whispered. That's impossible. I'm aware of your financial situation, Harrington said with false sympathy, which is why I've come to offer a solution that I believe will benefit us all. Miss Ashford, I am a widower in need of a wife. You are an unmarried lady in need of financial security. I propose a marriage that would solve both our problems. In exchange for your hand, I will forgive all debts owed by your family. Your mother will be provided for comfortably, and you will become mistress of Harrington Manor with all the privileges that position entails. The proposal was delivered with the casual efficiency of a business transaction, because that's exactly what it was. Not courtship, not romance, but a straightforward exchange her body and her future for her family's financial survival. That's very generous, Lord Harrington, Lady Margaret said quickly, hope flickering in her eyes like a candle in a draught. Very generous indeed. Beatrice would need time to consider such an offer, of course, but… No, Beatrice said clearly. Thank you for your offer, Lord Harrington, but I must decline. Harrington's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or something darker. Miss Ashford, I don't think you understand your position. Without my intervention, your family faces debtor's prison. Your mother is in poor health. The conditions in such places are quite terrible, particularly for elderly women of gentle birth. It was a threat, politely phrased but unmistakable. Marry me, or watch your mother suffer. I understand perfectly, Beatrice said, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her nails dug into her palms. And my answer remains no. Beatrice, her mother's voice was pleading, desperate. Perhaps we should discuss… There's nothing to discuss, Mamma. Beatrice met Harrington's eyes directly, refusing to look away, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. I will not marry a man I don't know and don't love to solve financial problems my father created. There must be another way. Harrington stood, his pleasant expression finally cracking to reveal irritation beneath. I'm afraid there isn't another way, Miss Ashford. I'm a patient man, but my patience has limits. I'll return in 1 week for your answer. I suggest you use that time to reconsider your priorities. Good day. After he left, Lady Margaret turned to Beatrice with tears streaming down her face. What have you done? What are you thinking? This was our only chance. Mamma, you don't know what kind of man he is. Beatrice pulled out the notes Caroline had compiled, pages of carefully documented rumours and suspicions. His first wife died under suspicious circumstances. 2 of his maids have disappeared. His tenant families are terrified of him. I can't. I won't. You won't save your mother from debtor's prison. Lady Margaret's voice broke. You won't prevent us from losing everything. There has to be another way, Beatrice insisted, though her voice wavered. Please, Mamma, trust me. There has to be. But as the days passed and Harrington's deadline approached, no other way presented itself, and Beatrice began to understand that sometimes being right, sometimes standing on principle, sometimes refusing to compromise your values, sometimes all of that wasn't enough. Sometimes the world simply crushed you anyway. At Thornhill Park, Sebastian received his secretary's report about mining accidents with hands that weren't entirely steady. Tommy Wright, age 9, crushed by overloaded coal cart, Northern Shaft, Thornhill Mines, June 15th, 1842. Mother, Sarah Wright, widow, 3 younger children. Father deceased from mining accident 3 years prior. Family compensation, none, as accident ruled result of worker negligence. Sebastian read the report 3 times, each reading making something tighten in his chest like a vice closing around his ribs. She'd been right. Beatrice Ashford had been completely, accurately, devastatingly right. He made further inquiries, visited his mines personally for the first time in years, saw the conditions with his own eyes, rather than through sanitized reports. Children covered in coal dust, their faces old despite their youth. Men working in darkness with inadequate safety equipment. Women sorting coal with hands bleeding from cuts. He spoke with Sarah Wright personally, a conversation that haunted him for days afterward. Her grief was a palpable thing, her poverty absolute, her despair complete. Tommy was a good boy, Your Grace, she said with the dignity of someone who had nothing left to lose. Smart, wanted to learn to read, but we needed his wages, see, after you cut the adult wages in half. 4 shillings a week, that's what children earn. We couldn't afford to feed the little ones without it. Sebastian left the meeting feeling something he hadn't felt in years, genuine, crushing shame. He began implementing reforms immediately, increased wages, reduced hours, improved safety protocol, no children under 12 in the mines, better housing for workers. It would cost him thousands of pounds in reduced profit. He didn't care. But the reforms, necessary as they were, didn't address the real problem. The woman who'd forced him to see his own blindness was being systematically destroyed by society while he lived in comfort, unfit to be anyone's wife. The words he'd spoken haunted him now, not because they'd been cruel, though they had been, but because they'd been completely wrong. When his investigator James Worth returned from discreet inquiries about Lord Philip Harrington with a report that made Sebastian's blood run cold, he knew he couldn't simply stand aside and let Beatrice Ashford face that particular monster alone. Not when he was partially responsible for making her vulnerable in the first place. Sebastian arrived at Ashford Cottage unannounced on a cold November morning, his carriage pulling up outside the shabby manor house with its peeling paint and overgrown garden. He knocked firmly, prepared to wait as long as necessary. The maid who answered looked shocked to see a duke on her doorstep. "Your Grace, we weren't expecting... Lady Margaret is... I'm here to see Miss Ashford," Sebastian said. "Please inform her that I will wait as long as necessary for an audience." The maid disappeared, returning 5 minutes later with uncertainty written all over her face. "Miss Ashford says she has nothing to say to you, Your Grace, and requests that you leave. Tell Miss Ashford that I am here to discuss Lord Philip Harrington, and that I won't leave until she hears what I have to say about." Another disappearance, another wait. This time it was 15 minutes. Then Beatrice appeared in the doorway, and Sebastian felt something jolt through him at the sight of her. She was pale, thinner than he remembered, with dark circles under those remarkable green eyes. She wore a simple day dress of faded blue that had clearly been turned and re-stitched multiple times. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe style that should have been unflattering, but somehow only emphasized the delicate bone structure of her face. She was, he realized with uncomfortable clarity, quite beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with character and intelligence and the kind of strength that came from enduring rather than surrendering. "Miss Ashford," he said, bowing with more courtesy than he'd shown her. "Your Grace." Her curtsy was mechanical, her tone glacial. "I can't imagine what you think we have to discuss. May I come in? This isn't a conversation for doorsteps." "Fine. 5 minutes. Then I want you to leave." She led him to a shabby morning room where a fire struggled gamely against the November cold. She didn't offer him a seat, didn't offer refreshment, just stood with her arms crossed and her chin raised in defiant challenge. "What do you want?" Sebastian had prepared a speech, careful words designed to explain and persuade. They all evaporated in the face of her direct question. "I was wrong," he said instead. "About the mines, about Tommy Wright, about you. I was completely and utterly wrong, and I'm sorry." Whatever Beatrice had been expecting, it wasn't that. Her arms dropped slightly, shock flickering across her features, before suspicion reasserted itself. "How convenient. Your belated conscience has awakened. That changes nothing. It changes everything for the families working in my mines. I've implemented reforms, real reforms, not performative gestures. Increased wages, improved safety, no children under 12. It's not enough. It can never be enough to compensate for what I allowed through negligence and willful blindness. But it's a start. And you want... what? My congratulations. My absolution." Her voice was bitter. "You destroyed my reputation, made me unmarriageable, turned me into a social pariah. But I suppose I should be grateful that you've developed a conscience about killing children in your minds." The words hit like blows, each one deserved. "No, I don't expect gratitude or forgiveness. I came because I have information about Lord Harrington that you need to hear." That got her attention. Her eyes sharpened, her body tensing. Sebastian pulled out Worth's report, laid it on a side table. "My investigator is very thorough. Harrington's first wife, Lady Anne, died from a fall down the stairs. The official ruling was accidental death, but there were inconsistencies. Bruises that predated the fall, servants who reported hearing violent arguments, a coroner's inquest that was concluded in less than a day without interviewing key witnesses." Beatrice's face had gone pale, but she said nothing. just listened with that fierce intelligence focused entirely on his words. 2 maids from his household have disappeared, Mary Collins and Susan Price. Collins was 17, Price was 16 and pregnant, Harrington's child, according to household gossip. Both vanished within days of each other. No bodies were ever found. No investigation was ever opened because the local magistrate owes Harrington substantial gambling debts and won't hear complaints against him. How do you know all this? Beatrice's voice was barely above a whisper. I hired an investigator. After you challenged me about my mines, I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored, including Harrington's reputation. When I learned he'd purchased your family's debts and was pressuring you for marriage, he stopped, not quite sure how to finish that sentence honestly. You felt guilty, Beatrice finished for him, and decided to intervene to assuage your conscience. Partly, Sebastian admitted, but also because I've seen what happens when powerful men prey on vulnerable women and no one stops them. Because I've been complicit in such systems my entire life without questioning them. And because... He paused, then decided on honesty. Because you were right about everything, Miss Ashford. And being right shouldn't result in destruction. Beatrice sank into a chair, her legs apparently no longer willing to support her. What am I supposed to do with this information? Harrington owns our debts. He's given us until tomorrow to accept his proposal. If I refuse, Mama faces debtor's prison. She's not strong, Your Grace. She wouldn't survive it, which is why I'm offering an alternative. Sebastian moved closer, careful not to crowd her. A strategic arrangement that protects you from Harrington while giving us both time to gather evidence against him. What kind of arrangement? A courtship, fake but public. You and I appear to be developing a romantic understanding. I escort you to social events, call on you regularly, give every appearance that I'm seriously considering you as my Duchess. This accomplishes several things. It makes Harrington's pursuit seem hopeless, which forces him to look elsewhere. It begins repairing your damaged reputation through association with my title, and it provides cover for my investigator to continue building a case against Harrington without drawing suspicion. Beatrice stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. You want to court me, the woman you publicly declared unfit to be anyone's wife. I was wrong about that. Society doesn't care if you were wrong. They'll think... She stopped, comprehension dawning. They'll think I've somehow entrapped you, that I'm using feminine wiles or desperation, or some combination thereof to force an advantageous match. It will confirm everything they already believe about me. Or, Sebastian countered, they'll think I've recognized the error of my initial assessment and am man enough to admit it, that I've found a woman of substance rather than a decorative ornament, that I value intelligence and courage over empty conformity. You give society far too much credit, probably, but it doesn't matter what they think in the long term. This is temporary, Miss Ashford. Once Harrington is dealt with, either legally destroyed or convinced to leave you alone, and once your family's debts are properly managed through other means, we can quietly end the arrangement. A mutual recognition that we wouldn't suit. Society will understand. No one expects dukes to actually marry penniless women with scandalous reputations. The words came out more harshly than he'd intended, and Beatrice flinched as if slapped. Right, of course, because I'm still fundamentally unfit, just temporarily useful. That's not what I meant. What are these other means for managing our debts? She cut him off, her tone businesslike, defensive walls slamming back into place. A properly structured loan through my bank, with reasonable terms and realistic repayment schedule. Your mother keeps her home and her dignity. I receive a modest return on investment. Everyone wins, except that I'll be in debt to you, beholden to you. It's a business transaction with documented terms, not charity or obligation. Your pride can remain intact. Beatrice stood, paced to the window, stared out at the overgrown garden. Sebastian watched her think, saw the rapid calculations happening behind those green eyes, the weighing of impossible options. I don't trust you, she said finally, without turning around. I don't blame you. You destroyed my reputation, called me unfit, made me a social pariah. Yes, and now you want me to pretend to care for you, to let you court me publicly. to act as though I've forgotten or forgiven what you did. I'm asking you to let me protect you from someone far more dangerous than I am, and to give me a chance to prove that I'm not entirely the monster you believe me to be." She turned then, meeting his eyes with that direct gaze that had fascinated him from the first. "What's in this for you, really? Don't tell me it's guilt or conscience or noble intentions. What do you actually gain from this arrangement?" The question was fair, more than fair, and it deserved an honest answer. "The satisfaction of knowing I prevented a predator from claiming another victim. The opportunity to use my privilege and resources for something other than accumulating more privilege and resources. And perhaps," he paused, choosing words carefully, "the chance to prove to myself that I can be better than I was at that ball, that your assessment of my character, while accurate at the time, doesn't have to define me permanently." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, and Sebastian had the uncomfortable sensation of being thoroughly evaluated and found wanting in ways he couldn't quite identify. "I have conditions," she said finally. Relief flooded through him, though he kept his expression neutral. "Name them." "This is a partnership of equal. You don't make decisions about my life or safety without consulting me. You don't treat me as a rescued damsel or a charity case. And the moment this arrangement is no longer serving both our interests, either of us can end it. No recriminations, no obligations beyond the loan agreement." "Agreed." Sebastian held out his hand. "Partners, Miss Ashford?" Beatrice looked at his extended hand for a long moment before placing hers in it. Her fingers were small and cold, but her grip was firm, decisive. "Partners, Your Grace, though God helps us both. I suspect this will end in disaster." "Quite possibly," Sebastian agreed, and felt something almost like a smile tug at his mouth. "But it should at least be an interesting disaster." Their first public appearance as a courting couple was at the county assembly 3 days later. Sebastian arrived at Ashford Cottage in his finest carriage, dressed impeccably in evening clothes that probably cost more than the Ashfords' annual income. He presented Lady Margaret with flowers, and Beatrice with a slim volume of poetry he'd noticed her examining in a bookshop window. "You've been watching me?" Beatrice asked as she accepted the gift. "Observing," Sebastian corrected. "There's a difference." The assembly hall was packed, every family in the county having somehow discovered that the Duke of Thornhill would be in attendance. When Sebastian entered with Beatrice on his arm, the conversations died mid-sentence, creating a wave of silence that spread through the room like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Whispers erupted immediately. Speculation, shock, confusion, delight at fresh scandal. Sebastian ignored all of it, leading Beatrice directly to the centre of the room where they would be most visible to the assembled guests. "Are you ready for this?" he murmured. "No, but I don't think I'll ever be, so we might as well proceed." They danced the opening waltz together, mandatory for a courting couple and guaranteed to set tongues wagging. Beatrice was a competent dancer, though she was tense in his arms at first, her shoulders rigid with anxiety. "Relax," Sebastian said quietly as they turned. "They're staring because they're shocked and fascinated. Let them stare. Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're calling a fortune hunter and a social climber. They'll call you worse things than that before this is over. Can you bear it?" She looked up at him, green eyes meeting grey, and Sebastian saw something fierce and unbroken in her gaze despite everything. "I've been born worse already. I can bear this." Something shifted in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of dancing. She was extraordinary, he realized, not despite her challenges to him, but because of them. Not despite her refusal to bow to society's expectations, but because of her courage in standing for what she believed, even when it cost her everything. The music ended, and Sebastian led her to the refreshment table, where Lord Harrington stood watching them with undisguised rage. "Your Grace!" Harrington's voice was tight, controlled fury barely contained. "Miss Ashford, how unexpected to see you together." "Lord Harrington." Sebastian's tone was coolly polite, his body positioned slightly in front of Beatrice in unconscious protection. "I understand you've had some business dealings with the Ashford family. I'm here to inform you that those matters have been resolved through other means. Miss Ashford is no longer in need of your assistance." Harrington's jaw clenched visibly. "Is that so? And does Miss Ashford speak for herself, or has she simply traded one form of obligation for another?" Before Sebastian could respond, Beatrice stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "I speak for myself perfectly well, Lord Harrington, and I'm informing you directly. I will not be marrying you under any circumstances. The Duke has graciously arranged alternative financing for my family's debts. Your leverage, as you so delicately termed it, no longer exists." It was a public rejection, delivered with witnesses present, and Harrington's face went white with rage before flushing dark red. "You're making a terrible mistake, Miss Ashford. His Grace is toying with you, using you for his own amusement before discarding you like yesterday's newspaper. When that happens, and it will, don't expect any assistance from me." "Then I'll face that circumstance if it arises," Beatrice said with a calmness Sebastian privately admired. "Good evening, Lord Harrington." They walked away together, leaving Harrington seething behind them. Once they were out of immediate earshot, Beatrice released a shaky breath. "Well, I've now publicly rejected and humiliated a dangerous man. What could possibly go wrong?" "Everything," Sebastian said grimly. "Which is why you and your mother are moving to Thornhill Park tomorrow. No arguments." "That's highly improper." "So is attempted murder, which is what Harrington will likely consider next. Worth's been watching him. He's desperate, Miss Ashford, desperately in debt to creditors who don't accept late payments gracefully. He needed your estate to satisfy them. Now that option is closed, he'll lash out." Beatrice opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. "Fine. But Mama and I have our own rooms, separated from yours by multiple hallways and several locked doors. I'm already courting scandal. I won't court ruin." Agreed. The weeks that followed settled into a strange new rhythm. Beatrice and Lady Margaret occupied the east wing of Thornhill Park in beautifully appointed rooms that made Ashford Cottage seem even more shabby by comparison. Sebastian called on them daily, sometimes taking Beatrice riding through his grounds, sometimes simply sitting in the library discussing everything from political philosophy to agricultural reform to the books they'd both read. They argued constantly about economics, about workers' rights, about the proper role of aristocracy in modern society. But the arguments felt different now, not hostile, but intellectually stimulating, a genuine exchange of ideas rather than a battle. "You're a Tory," Beatrice accused one afternoon as they debated parliamentary reform. "I'm a pragmatist," Sebastian corrected. "I don't believe in radical change that destroys valuable institutions, and I don't believe in preserving institutions that crush people for the benefit of the powerful. So reform them from within. Work with the system rather than trying to destroy it." "How can I work with a system that excludes me entirely? I can't vote, can't hold property in my own name, can't even control my own money if I marry. The system wasn't designed for someone like me to have any voice whatsoever." "Then marry someone who'll give you a voice, someone who values your opinions and will act on them." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Sebastian had intended. Beatrice looked at him with something like surprise, then confusion, then a shuttering of expression that closed her off completely. "This isn't real," she reminded him quietly. "We're playing roles, partners in a strategic arrangement, nothing more." Right, of course. But Sebastian was beginning to realize that somewhere between the public performances and the private conversations, between the shared meals and the debates that stretched into evenings, he'd stopped playing a role. He was falling in love with Beatrice Ashford, not despite her challenges, but because of them. Not despite her refusal to conform, but because of her courageous authenticity. She made him think harder, question more, see beyond his own comfortable assumptions. She made him want to be worthy of her respect, even if he could never hope for her love. It was the most inconvenient, impossible thing he'd ever experienced. Caroline noticed it first, cornering Beatrice one afternoon in the Thornhill Park garden. "You're in love with him. Don't be ridiculous. This is a pretense, protection, strategy. Then why do you smile when his letters arrive? Why do you spend hours getting ready for his visits? Why do you defend him when I make jokes about dukes being fundamentally useless? Beatrice had no good answer, because the truth was frightening in occasions. She was falling for Sebastian Blackwood, despite every reasonable objection her mind could raise, despite the fact that he'd destroyed her reputation, despite knowing this arrangement was temporary and he'd never actually marry someone like her. Even if I did care for, which I'm not admitting, it wouldn't matter. I'm a strategic convenience, a way to prove he's more enlightened than society believes. When this ends, he'll marry someone appropriate. Someone with fortune and connections and a reputation that hasn't been shredded. And you'll just accept that? Watch him marry someone else? What choice do I have? It was a question Beatrice asked herself repeatedly as November became December, and their fake courtship continued. Sebastian was attentive, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in her opinions. But was it real, or was he simply an excellent actor playing his part convincingly? Then Harrington made his move, and questions of real versus fake became suddenly, terrifyingly irrelevant. It started with Lady Margaret's accident. Her carriage wheel came loose on a perfectly maintained road, sending the vehicle careening into a ditch. Lady Margaret escaped with bruises and a sprained wrist, but it could have been far worse. The groom who examined the wheel afterward reported that the bolts had been deliberately loosened. Someone had sabotaged the carriage. Harrington, Sebastian said flatly when he heard. Worth's been watching him. He's growing desperate. Security at Thornhill Park tripled overnight. Guards patrolled the grounds constantly. No one entered without thorough vetting. Both women were instructed not to leave the house without armed escort. Beatrice chafed at the restrictions like a caged bird, but she couldn't deny the fear that had settled in her chest like cold lead. Harrington was dangerous, cornered and desperate and willing to hurt innocent people to achieve his goals. The note arrived 3 days after Lady Margaret's accident, slipped under Beatrice's door by means no one could determine despite all the security. The Duke will tire of his charity project. You're a novelty, nothing more. When he discards you, I'll be waiting. Your mother walks in the gardens daily. Accidents happen so easily to elderly women. Consider your choices carefully. Beatrice showed Sebastian the note with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain calm. His face went white with fury, jaw clenching so hard she could see the muscle jump. That's it. Worth arrests him tonight. I don't care if we don't have enough evidence for murder. We have enough for terroristic threats and attempted harm. I won't wait. Beatrice touched his arm, felt the tension vibrating through him. If you arrest him on weak charges, his solicitors will have him out within hours. Men like Harrington don't face real consequences unless the case is absolutely airtight. We need more than threats and a suspicious carriage accident. I won't risk you or your mother waiting for airtight evidence. Then help me prove him guilty, properly, completely, so he can't hurt anyone else ever again. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment, conflict clear in his grey eyes. Finally, he nodded. Worth found something yesterday. One of the missing maids, Mary Collins. She's alive, living in Bristol under an assumed name. If we can convince her to testify, then let me go with Worth to speak with her, woman to woman. She might trust me in ways she won't trust your male investigator. It was dangerous and irregular and completely characteristic of Beatrice to volunteer. Sebastian wanted to refuse, wanted to keep her safely locked away at Thornhill Park until this was over. Instead, he said, I'm coming with you. They travelled to Bristol under assumed names, just Sebastian and Beatrice and Worth, leaving Lady Margaret safely guarded at Thornhill Park. Mary Collins lived in a shabby boarding house near the docks, supporting herself through seamstress work and living in constant fear. She was 22 years old and looked 40, with haunted eyes and a nervousness that spoke of trauma she couldn't articulate. Beatrice sat with her for 3 hours, patient and gentle, earning trust through shared vulnerability rather than interrogation. He got me pregnant, Mary finally whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. I was 17, stupid, though he cared about me. When I told him, he flew into a rage, said I was trying to trap him, ruin him. Then Susan, the other maid, she disappeared, just gone one day. And I knew what he'd done to her, How did you escape? Beatrice asked gently. Climbed out my window at night. Ran. I kept running until I reached Bristol. Lost the baby from the stress of it all. Her voice broke. Sometimes I'm grateful for at least it's not growing up knowing what its father was. Would you testify? Sebastian asked quietly. We can protect you, provide lawyers, security, a new start afterward. Mary looked at him with those haunted eyes. What good would it do? He's a lord. I'm nobody. Who would believe me? I would, Beatrice said firmly, and I'll stand beside you. We'll face him together. Something shifted in Mary's expression. Hope, fragile as spun glass. All right, I'll testify. With Mary's testimony, Worth was able to build a case strong enough that even Harrington's wealth and connections couldn't dismiss it. Formal charges were filed. Conspiracy to commit murder regarding his first wife's death, unlawful imprisonment and probable murder of Susan Price, terroristic threats against the Ashford family. The scandal erupted across Kent like wildfire. Society was shocked, horrified, grimly fascinated, and Beatrice, who had been dismissed as a social pariah mere months ago, was suddenly being praised for her courage in resisting Harrington's advances and helping bring him to justice. The vindication was dizzying, disorienting, and utterly incomplete, because Sebastian had gone quiet. Since returning from Bristol, since the charges against Harrington had been filed, he'd been distant, polite but reserved, present but emotionally absent. Beatrice finally cornered him in his study one evening after dinner. What's wrong? You've barely spoken to me in 3 days. Sebastian stood at his window, back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. Nothing's wrong. Harrington will be tried and likely transported or hung. Your mother is safe. Your reputation is largely restored. The arrangement has served its purpose. The arrangement. The words landed like stones in still water. So we're done, Beatrice said flatly. The fake courtship ends now that the immediate danger has passed. That was always the plan. Right, of course. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. Just business, nothing personal. Sebastian turned then, and the look on his face was something between anguish and resignation. Don't, he said roughly. Don't pretend this was ever just business for either of us. What do you want me to say? That I've fallen in love with you despite every reasonable objection? That the thought of ending this arrangement feels like being flayed alive? That I lie awake, wondering if anything between us was real, or if I was just a convenient way for you to assuage your guilt? It was real. The words burst out of him with desperate intensity. All of it. Every conversation. Every moment. I wasn't pretending, Beatrice. I was falling in love with you while trying to pretend I wasn't, while knowing you could never truly forgive me for what I said at that ball, for destroying your reputation. Beatrice stared at him, heart hammering. You're in love with me. Desperately, hopelessly, completely. Sebastian moved toward her, stopped just out of reach. You were right about everything, Beatrice. About the mines, about my privilege, about my willful blindness. You challenged me when everyone else flattered me. You made me see myself clearly for the first time in my life. You made me want to be worthy of you. But I can't ask you to marry me. Not after what I did. Not after calling you unfit in front of everyone. Why not? The question stopped him cold. Because you deserve better than the man who destroyed you. What if I don't want better? Beatrice moved closer, close enough to see the conflict in his grey eyes. What if I want the flawed, growing, genuinely trying man who implemented mine reforms and hunted down a predator and stood beside me when I testified? What if I want the person who argues with me about philosophy and values my opinions and makes me laugh despite everything? Beatrice, you hurt me, she said firmly. What you said at that ball, utterly unfit, that hurt, deeply, but you changed. Not just apologized, but actually changed. You became someone different, someone better. And somewhere in that transformation, I fell in love with you too. You love me. His voice was raw with hope and disbelief. Unfortunately, yes. Most inconveniently. Against all reasonable judgment, Sebastian laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy, and closed the remaining distance between them. His hands framed her face with reverent care. I called you unfit. I was catastrophically wrong. You're extraordinary. I'm opinionated and stubborn and entirely too vocal about workers' rights. Exactly. Perfect. He kissed her then, and it wasn't the careful, strategic kiss of their public performances. It was real and desperate and full of promise. Beatrice melted into him, into this impossible moment that felt more right than anything in her life. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, properly, not for strategy or protection, but because I love you, because you make me better, because I want to spend my life proving I was wrong to call you unfit, and right to fall completely in love with you. Yes, Beatrice whispered. Yes, you are an impossible man. Yes. The wedding was held in February 1843 at St. Mary's Church in Kent, and it was nothing like the grand society affair anyone expected. The church was packed with an unusual mix of guests. Aristocrats sat alongside tenant farmers. Mine workers' families occupied pews next to lords and ladies. Caroline sat in the front row, crying happy tears into her handkerchief. Sebastian stood at the altar, watching Beatrice walk toward him on Vicar Fletcher's arm, and his throat tightened with emotion. She wore ivory silk, simple but elegant, and she'd never looked more beautiful. When she reached him, when he took her hand, he felt the rightness of it settle into his bones. The vicar performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, but it was Sebastian's vows that made half the congregation weep. 6 months ago, I called you utterly unfit to be anyone's wife. I was blind, arrogant, and catastrophically wrong. You are the finest person I've ever known. You challenged me when I needed challenging. You refused to accept my comfortable lies. You made me see the world clearly for the first time in my privileged life. His voice roughened with emotion. I'm the one who was unfit. Unfit for your courage, your compassion, your unwavering commitment to truth and justice. But you gave me a chance to become better, to grow, to earn your love through action rather than empty words. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift. Beatrice's own vows were simpler, but no less powerful. You hurt me, then you changed. Genuinely, completely changed. You proved that people can grow, that privilege doesn't have to mean blindness, that aristocrats can care about something beyond their own comfort. You proved me wrong about giving up on you, and I will spend my life reminding you. The congregation laughed through their tears. When Sebastian kissed his bride, the church erupted in a... The Duke and the Woman's Society had deemed unfit, joined forever in a marriage that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. 3 years later, Beatrice stood in the nursery at Thornhill Park, holding their son Thomas, named for Tommy Wright, while Sebastian read aloud from the morning newspaper. The Factory Reform Act passed its third reading yesterday, he reported. Full implementation expected within the year. Our draft language, Beatrice asked, shifting Thomas to her other hip. Most of it. The committee adopted your recommendations on working hours and safety protocols almost verbatim. Beatrice smiled. She'd spent 2 years working with reformist politicians and labour organisers, using her position as Duchess to amplify voices that would otherwise go unheard. Sebastian supported her completely, even when it made his fellow aristocrats uncomfortable. They'd become known as the reforming Duke and Duchess, and society had largely accepted what they couldn't change. Beatrice Ashford had proven herself not by conforming to expectations, but by remaining exactly who she was, opinionated, passionate, unwilling to compromise her principles for anyone's comfort. I was thinking, Sebastian said, setting aside the newspaper, about what you said at that ball, about me being blind to suffering. You were right. I know I was. But you changed, because you challenged me, because you refused to let me hide behind comfortable ignorance. He moved closer, wrapped his arms around her and their son. I love you for that, for all of it, even when I'm insufferably right about everything, especially then. Thomas gurgled happily between them, and Beatrice leaned into her husband's warmth, marveling at how far they'd come, from enemies to partners to spouses, from utterly unfit to duchess and mother and reformer. She'd proved Sebastian wrong about her unfit, but more importantly, they'd both proved that people could change, that love could grow from the most unlikely beginnings, and that sometimes the best marriages were the ones no one expected to succeed. The woman society deemed unfit had become exactly what she was always meant to be, herself, unapologetically and completely, and that was the greatest vindication of all.